Okay, my friends. So here we go for this data day. I mean, obviously, you'd have to be living under a rock to not know about Milton, but there's a few things going on here. What's the fallout of the ILA and everything coming back on track so soon? What is the impact of Milton that already had a hurricane hit, what, a week and a half ago? And how is that going to impact the OTR market? I can tell you one thing, just from what I saw yesterday, rates have already been impacted. Hey there, my friends. Welcome back to the Logistics Life. Dean, unreal. I have some very live data for you. So I'm working with a customer right now that's looking for west to east freight, okay? And that East Coast freight is North Carolina and Georgia is the locations where we're delivering.
Right.
And very interesting fact. So I was speaking to a good buddy of mine who does a ton of US domestic. And we were getting numbers coming back on like 1,267 miles at $2,900. And I was like, that seems very high to me. So I called him just to make sure, because sometimes, you know, if you don't do a lot of US domestic, you don't always get the same numbers that somebody does US domestic for. Like I noticed the US market is very different than the Canadian market. Like Canadian carriers will have a specific price they need to go. And whether you do a lot of Canadian or none, you'll get a very minimal discount, but it won't be massive. And so I called my friend. He goes, and this was not yesterday, the day before. And he goes, Dan, no. He goes, like, flatbeds are $1.99 a mile all in. He goes, dry vans are not. They're way cheaper. So I said, would you mind doing some research for me and just letting me know like what I'm looking at? Well, very interesting. Dean gets back to me yesterday morning and he goes, I'm sorry, I was wrong. He goes, we're getting rates of 2,900 because of Milton, because of everything happening, because it's not just, it's kind of like the other storm, right? North Carolina got flooded. And I think there's still people missing in North Carolina. Like it's the fallout. He goes, not only that, FEMA's buying up most of the equipment in that area in preparation for after the storm goes through. And I thought it was very interesting because I know we've been talking a lot about, you know, what is going to, is there a particular instance, I'm going to say, and I know for all of you living in that hurricane, I don't mean to minimize what you're going through, but like a situation in the market that's going to make a flip, right? We thought it was ILA. We thought, I mean, these guys are going to be on strike for a minimum of 2 weeks. I think they caved in like 9 hours or something. But it you know, it's interesting that we're already seeing in that particular, like California to that East Coast lane, variations in rates, and I'm interested to see what you're seeing.
What lane was that you were talking about? Was it
so
Toronto
it was
to Charlotte?
From Los Angeles.
Oh, right. Yep.
To Henderson, North Carolina.
Henderson, NC. Here we go. All right. So Los Angeles to Henderson is showing at about it's 3-day rate. 7-day average rate is at 211 right now.
Okay. So we were 2,900 on 1,267 miles. So,
well, hang on. No, Los Angeles to Henderson is 2,500 miles.
Oh, sorry. No. Yeah. Okay. So 54.
5,400.
Yeah. 5465. That one was to Wisconsin. Okay. Los Angeles to Wisconsin was the 299. So what were you showing? 211?
45. Yeah, 211. Milwaukee's at $1.93, so that's going to be around 4,100 for a full load.
Yeah, okay.
But all those rates are heading up. But Dan, that's also consistent with the record number of imports that came into Los Angeles. So any capacity off the West Coast is going to be tighter because we just had a record September. So when you look at the volume of containers that came in September, it was the highest ever for the month of September, but it was only a few thousand containers less than last month. So the volume coming into the West Coast because of the ILA strike, even before the ILA strike, the diversion was already on the water because it takes 3 weeks from, say, Shanghai to Los Angeles. So that's why you're seeing higher, and that'll still go on. Like that'll go on through the end of the year. There'll still be higher volumes on the West Coast. So that you'll see that upward rate movement but you're going to see a lot more rate movement around the, east of the Mississippi in particular. Because I think the key data point from last week's data, because it was the first full week of data, including the ILA strike, which lasted 3 days, which didn't cover all of the big markets, like only Elizabeth, New Jersey, and Atlanta, right? So if you think about, Dallas, Fort Worth, Los Angeles, Chicago, they're a little bit bigger in volume than the Atlanta combined market, but Atlanta's inland, so Savannah's like not a big freight market. It's big, but it's not the biggest. So you just didn't see the impact on the ILA strike side. Where you saw the impact, and this is a really important point for our listeners to understand, volumes dropped last week. So the volume of loads moving dropped last week. That's a really important thing to understand. So the volume of loads nationally dropped about 3%, but rates went up 3%. So you say to yourself, how do rates go up if volumes drop? Well, one of the things that happened is it wasn't that we had, and again, this is my theory, and it plays out pretty much every time. It wasn't because we had fewer trucks available. It was because the trucks we had available slowed way down. The freight network slowed down because of the weather and the road closures. So it decreases capacity, right? So if you lose 500,000 trucks, capacity drops. But if you don't lose the 500,000 trucks and it stays the same, but all of those trucks slow down, has the same effect on a capacity. It decreases the available capacity because with hours of service, trucks are not running as many miles because of road closures and rain. And when you take out I-26, I-40, a couple of hundred roads in around the Carolinas, and then you've got all of the wet weather that's been coming, you can see how the network slowed way down. You had power outages. You had a couple of million people at the peak, all the way from Tallahassee, all the way up into the Western North Carolina market without power, even into the Ohio Valley. So when you have power outages like that, people at home don't have power, but people at factories don't have power. And people aren't working. So you could see the whole freight network sort of not grind to a halt, but it slowed way down to the point where it forced rates up. So nationally, Hurricane Helene moved the rate needle, which is not typical, right? Normally when you have a wind event that whips through and makes landfall and then breaks apart, you don't see necessarily a national impact like we've seen. But in the Southeast, so if national rates went up, a couple of pennies, in the Southeast where Hurricane Helene made its impact all the way through the Southeast, rates went up 10 cents a mile in that area, both inbound and out. Right? So the volume of loads moving dropped in that region because of the hurricane, but rates went up because capacity was tighter because fewer trucks were available because they were slowed way down. So that was sort of the summary of last week. It was one of those weeks where even before last week, rates were moving up. This is sort of starting to accelerate the movement of rates up. And Dan, it's eerily reminiscent of what happened in September of 2017 when we had 2 Cat 5s and a Cat 4 hit. We had Irma, Maria, Jose, and the 4th one forgets me that happened in late August. So when you start to see that upset a freight market as capacity's been exiting, remember we said on the show a few months ago, when capacity is at the bottom of the market like this, when it's exiting, it doesn't take much to disrupt the market.
Yes.
Right. So what we're seeing now is the impact of volatility moving the rate needle, especially in the spot market, substantially. So that's what we saw last week. But Milton is a whole nother, deal, right? And it's going to affect the peninsula of Florida, which again aren't big freight markets per se. They're probably, when we're not in produce season, right? We're just starting, the plugs for strawberries are just being planted now. So we're a ways away from the Florida produce season starting. It will impact all the vegetables that come out of there, of course. But we're not at the peak shipping season. We're past Mother's Day, Valentine's Day, where you see massive volumes coming out of South Florida. So you're seeing a lot of inbound volume. Florida is always a backhaul market for carriers, as you well know. In the spot market, for every 1.5 loads that go in, only one comes out. Right? So there's always an imbalance of trucks. So they're always having higher rates to come in than go out. I think that'll accelerate. So you'll see rates much higher going inbound than you will because there's less coming out. So carriers have got to factor in that deadhead to come back north. So you're starting to see some market volatility on a whole nother level. And I'm just going to type in here quickly Atlanta to Lakeland, because it's our busiest. This will tell you exactly what the market's going to do, because Atlanta to Lakeland, Florida is our busiest freight lane for refrigerated freight. But it's no mistake that Lakeland is the epicenter of produce, Plant City, Orlando, Disney World, all of those locations are there. Atlanta to Lakeland rates are up around 354. They're sitting at the highest level they've been in 12 months. So you can see that starting to move there. That's just this week.
And you know, one thing, I was having a conversation with a buddy of mine. He's got 15 trucks and 30 trailers. And so he's always operated at a 2-to-1 ratio. And one of the things that he was telling me last week, because he goes, Dan, I'm almost crippled right now. And I go, what do you mean? He goes, well, a lot of my freight is North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, those areas. And he goes, and I have customers that are now closed because their power's out. He goes, but I have trailers loaded in my yard that I can't deliver. And
everything
he goes,
shuts down. Wow.
Yeah. And he's like, so now I have customers down there where he goes, thank the Lord is an expression, but he says, they've obviously slowed down because they're impacted by the storm as well. He goes, but if I would need to make a move, he goes, I can't. But he goes, my customers up here have more orders to ship. And he goes, because these orders are already processed and through the system, he goes, I might need to rent 10 trailers. So you think of that added expense. I mean, it's no fault to the company for not receiving them, but there's this added expense. And he says, and with what's happened in the market, goes like, I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to cover these additional expenses. He goes, don't get me wrong, Dan, it's like 10 trailers. He goes, so it's not, hundreds of thousands of dollars a month. He goes, but it's because we were talking about, what small little things can tip the scale. And he goes, so, he goes, you think of this, I can't send much freight outbound. So I've got 15 drivers. I can send maybe 3 outbound because we do a bit of West Coast. He goes, but now I've got 12 drivers that might be sitting for a week and a half. Like he goes, I'll have to find other freight. He goes, and now I'm going to go on, the load link or some kind of load board. He goes, like you and I both know, we call them Cracker Jack loads because half the time don't know what kind of surprise you're going to get in the box. Right. And he goes so now his big fear is the jeopardy of drivers saying, well, I need to work. I need my income coming in. I understand there was an issue in North Carolina and customers aren't, but what are you doing as the company to keep me moving? So his big fear now is losing drivers, because then he loses drivers. He has trucks sitting. Now there's a massive financial impact, right? So this, as you call it, the ripple effect or the weight that these things leave behind, I think are super powerful. And I don't know how many people pay attention to that stuff.
I think that's a great example of what I was talking about with the volume of loads going down and rates going up because the network slowed. That is a great example of the network slowing to a halt with one carrier. Now magnify that across all carriers, and you start to see, when you shut down the Florida Peninsula of that inbound freight, suddenly all of those trucks that are loaded inbound to Florida, they're stopped. Like that freight has stopped, to your example, and your friend is probably caught up in all of that. So we're going to see, just like the ILA port's going to take 2 to 3 weeks to clear the backlog of 40 ships that were held up off as a result of the 3-day slowdown, you're going to see the effect of this ripple all the way through the end of the year. And I say that because we're only a few weeks away from Christmas tree shipping, fresh turkeys,
road salt,
all produce, road salt. So you start, and then you start to get into winter heating oil, replenishment. So what you start to see is this seasonality that always starts 3 weeks ahead of Thanksgiving, and rates start to go up. And if capacity's been exiting because this year hasn't been a profitable year, what you start to see is this upward inflection in spot rates. For those left standing, it becomes a very profitable market because, I was on the Rates and Lanes show with Chuck Snow and Rico Muhammad last night, and we were talking about seasonality. So what we're seeing is seasonality return to the market. So remember during, like, for the last 3 years, we've just said seasonality's been non-existent.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, Dan, it's back. Now, peak shipping season's a little bit earlier because of the people avoiding the ILA strike. But what we're seeing is normal seasonality that you could bank on pretty much happening on cue, because my 35-day rate forecast that I ran yesterday now include out to the second week of November. And guess what I'm seeing in the forecasts is this seasonality start to lift spot rates. So you want to bet that if you're, a regional carrier along the Mississippi River where all the fresh turkeys come from, the getting's going to be good. Right, you're going to make some serious money. If you're in the Yakima Valley, anywhere where you've got fall produce, apples, pears, dry onions. If you're in the Pacific Maritimes, right now, of course, you're going to be hauling as much lumber as you can out of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, right, and Maine, for the rebuilding effort. If you're a flatbedder in New Orleans or Houston, you want to bet you're going to see a lot of flatbed volume heading east to the Florida Peninsula and the Tallahassee market around the Panhandle. So we're heading into a part of the market where there are some external forces impacting the market that the catalysts that you normally see that change the supply-demand metric. Because remember on the show a couple of weeks ago, we were saying we didn't see anything on the horizon that's going to fundamentally change the market. Well,
yep.
And I think we always said the caveat is always hurricane season. That's a wild card. And of course, it's panned out to be just like that. And now throw on top of that a Middle East conflict, right? The West Texas Intermediate oil has gone up about $5 to $6 a barrel in the last few weeks. Diesel went up 4 cents this week. If Israel attacks Iran and its infrastructure for oil, and then Iran says, you know what, we're going to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, which is 30% of the world's LNG, 25% of the world's crude. If they shut down that little 30-mile passage, you want to bet we're going to see a ripple effect at the diesel pump at some point, driving up everyone's costs. So there's some things happening that in a market where capacity's been exiting for well over a year, maybe 1.5 years, you start to get to a point where it becomes an inflection, an observable inflection in the market. That's what it feels like we're heading into. So in a rather perverse is probably the wrong way, but it's like it's finally some good news for carriers and brokers, because you've talked about how bad this has been. There's been no feedback. Like there was nothing positive happening for all of the hard work brokers and 3PLs have been putting in, because it was just a flat market that was trying to readjust.
Yeah.
And it looks like we're going to go from that to total chaos, right? Because that's what a hurricane like Milton does to a freight market in a region.
Yeah, Dean, it's interesting, right? Because I remember at the beginning of hurricane season, you and I were talking about the warnings that they said, right? They were like, this is going to be an unbelievably horrible season, and
right.
And we didn't see anything. Like there was very little movement up until 2 weeks ago. And then all of a sudden it's like bam, bam, bam. And, I was watching this morning as we were talking about, I'm finding much better information on YouTube than even on any cable channel. And I was watching a live report, and, yesterday it was, could be a 3, could be a 4, Cat 3, Cat 4 by the time it hits. And then wake up this morning and they're like, it's still a Cat 5 hurricane at 160 miles, where normally it would be a 4 by now, which would mean 3 by the time it hits, 2 central and then 1 kind of the east coast of Florida. And the meteorologist this morning was like, we don't know. There's a little eye forming in the center, but he goes, that was there yesterday, and that's what's typical of it slowing down. You were talking about the surges that are coming in. And then I was watching yesterday where one reporter was saying, so here's the thing. It's not just the hurricane. It's the fact that Helene went through and now has created all this shrapnel that's now going to be spun up. And this is where they were, minus the wave surges and stuff. But this is and again, this is just the news reporting. I'm not a hurricane specialist at all. But this is where they were saying is going to be the major destruction. It's like taking 100 grenades and thrown them into a hurricane and them just exploding because the destruction's already there. So it's going to take these little shrapnel pieces and just fire them everywhere because it's weighs much less than an entire house, you know? So, and then you're looking and you're, I mean, the pictures that you sent me yesterday, Dean.
Horrible.
I was telling people yesterday, it looked like episode 1 of The Walking Dead. You know, when they're driving down the highway in Georgia, and I was like people are in the middle of the highways driving through and just like weaving through traffic, and to me it's one of these things where you look at it and it was you know, not to get, you know, morbid or anything, but it was like when, to me anyways, I felt the same feeling and eeriness when the second plane hit the tower back in 2001. Like it to me, it was like Die Hard. Like, that's an image from Die Hard. And when I saw those images yesterday, that you sent me, it was just, it brought back all of that. Like, is this real? Is this like,
and we've been talking about this volatility, like things like the extreme. It's really hard to ignore how much more severe it just feels. Like people say, oh, there's no climate change. And I say, but in my 65 years, the climate has changed. I've seen it and felt it. I have skin cancers to prove it, right? So I've seen the damage. Now, that's only a 65-year sample of one person. So does that mean anything? Well, I can't deny it because I've seen and felt it and experienced it myself. But when you talk to people, though, in these hurricanes, they went through Helene and they said, we've never seen anything like that. And then you hear people coming out saying, this will be the biggest storm to hit Tampa since 1921.
Yeah.
Like, so you start to say, okay, these what's the word I'm trying to say? Apocalyptic events are now eerily similar to what you would see in some sort of movie, because it's like, it's unbelievable to see the damage that's occurred in a place like Asheville, of all places, high up in the mountains, where flash flooding, where there was a very low probability of this happening, it happened. And that's what, you know, I think we started the year and said, you know, it's been a fairly flat, boring hurricane season. And I said, well, this was September 9. If you remember, I said, well, 40% of hurricanes happen after September 9. And here we are in a matter of weeks where the whole event has just lit up. So this is, you know, a nasty week for a lot of people. I can never take joy out of the freight market turning, because there's hundreds of people that have lost their lives. There are businesses that are devastated. There are roads that are closed. There is, I think the worst is yet to come, Dan. We haven't seen the worst of Hurricane Helene and Milton combined in like the matter of 2 weeks. We haven't seen, because Milton's going to arrive 2 weeks after Helene did. And the scary part was, Lester Holt on NBC News last night was walking around looking in Florida, and they were showing all the piles of debris from 2 weeks ago that trucks were still trying to take away. And of course, that becomes, you know, extra fuel for a wind event to throw missiles around and create more carnage. So I don't know that we've seen the worst of this yet. We're certainly seeing the worst of people with all the lies that are being told from a political perspective. That's heinous what's going on there. That's not helping anybody.
No.
So I think we're in one of those times where it just feels like the whole world is on fire, like in terms of risk. But what comes out of that is we're a very resilient bunch. You know, we always find ways to come out the other side in better shape. And I think we're going through this phase in the market where we've had to clean out, right? All the opportunistic folks that entered the market that you had to play hardball against, that were undercutting, both broker and carrier side. It really feels like we've got to the end of that.
Yes, I agree with that. And, you know, I look at it also, and I'm talking to a lot of customers lately, and one of the conversations, a big conversation we're having, or I'm having anyways, and I'm asking, and I'm saying, what are the increased costs that you're incurring right now? Like, because I do believe, Dean, and this is something, if I could wish one thing right now, it would be that everybody in our logistics and supply chain world understand this. This is all collaborative. It's not competition. Sure, company versus company, but like, you know, if the car companies can get along, so can we. right? You invent, you create products that people want. In logistics, we create services that people need, right? Do people need vehicles? Yes, they need a vehicle. Do they need a Mercedes over a Honda? No, that's a want, right? You need four wheels, 3 wheels. Hell, you can even use 2 wheels in most states to get you where you need to go any time of the year. But the thing is, it's collaborative. And, you know, I'm speaking with customers and I'm saying, you know, you diverted all these ships for the ILA strike. What is that financial impact on you? And they're like, well, we don't even know yet because A, it's costing us 3 times as much to destuff containers in California. B, now we're going from what would normally be like, you know, North Carolina or Georgia to the central location to a state that has more laws on trucks than any other state in the US, that has a tighter capacity than any other state in the US. We were paying $1.60 a mile. We're paying $2.40 a mile over here. And, you know, not only that, our ocean costs us more. Not only did it cost us more, it added a week and a half to 2 weeks in transit. And there's all these things happening. And yet we're still looking at these singular pieces of the puzzle. Right. I speak to salespeople and they're going, oh man, I can't wait. Rates are going to change. I'm going to start making some profit. And I'm like, okay, hold on. Whoa. Like that mentality is in my opinion, again, you know, the audience might crucify me. They may not. So be it. Some will, some won't. So what? But where is the happy medium? Where everybody gets along. And, you know, and the reason that sparked it is when you were talking about, you know, the media and political and people lying. Like, you know, we have leaders in Canada lying, leaders in the US lying. Like people, you know, I was listening to something this morning. It was actually Lewis Howes. I don't know if you ever heard Lewis Howes' podcast, The School of Greatness. Amazing. He had Kevin Hart on. And they were talking about, you know, just society and life. And he said, you know, it's interesting. He said, you know, you look at the amount of money that was raised for people during the pandemic, right? He goes, but you look at places that were devastated and have no support. He goes, like functionally, this world is fragmented. And it started me thinking through this, saying, yeah, I mean, what would have happened if during the pandemic we all stuck together? Because I'll be honest with you, Dean, I speak to a lot of traffic managers and they're still sour, thinking they got the short end of the stick, which probably most of them did during the pandemic. It was like, nobody cared about my costs. It was just, and don't get me wrong, I get it, Dean. It is supply and demand, like everything in life. You know, as supply goes down and demand is rising, people increase prices. I don't agree with it because I'm thinking if you've priced something, you know, you look at a corporation, for example, right? You price it out at you know, 20% margin, you're healthy, you're good. Software, you know, maybe 80% margin, you're healthy, you're good. If everyone just kept those margins, I think there would be more of a flat line. And maybe these conversations that we're having right now, where it's a carrier market, it's a shipper market, it's a broker market, it's a like, I don't know. And maybe I'm babbling and I apologize if I am, but I don't know. I just think there's a better way.
Yeah. So a completely different subject and probably a good way to end the show is, did you see they took down the 67-year-old Tropicana last night in Las Vegas?
No.
So it's the last of the old, you know, Rat Pack era hotels. They imploded it. 22 seconds. 22 seconds, and it's going to make way for the 33,000 seat, $1.5 billion Oakland A's Major League Stadium that's going to be built. Right? They used something like how many thousand? I was like about 2,200 pounds of explosives. Anyway, they had a big drone show. And they're called Drone Onyx, where they put pyrotechnics on drones and kind of make these really cool. They made the Oakland A's symbol and the Tropicana symbol. What got me thinking about this was the big, it's called Gemini, the big solar-powered factory that's going on outside of Las Vegas. It's one of the biggest solar powered factories in the world, or plants in the world. I did some studies on it yesterday. 3,000 truckloads from Perrysburg, Ohio, to Las Vegas to build it. That's just that's just the solar panels. And then you got cabling, steel, stanchions. What got me thinking about this was in all the doom and gloom, there's all this infrastructure that's being built that's starting to come online, and it's driving so much freight demand for carriers. And that's why I think you get lost in the noise of bad news, and you can't see what's really happening under the covers, because things are happening that are good. They're changing. Like they're changing. They're just different. But it's I think it's all good as you look down the road.
I agree. And it's that typical process where it's the worst news, the bad news travels way faster than the good news.
Yep. Oh, right. It sells. Well, look at our election and how we're doing all of that. So yeah, happy days.